Well, welcome to session 4 of this trip through the biblical orchard, finding real-life models of where the fruit of the Spirit has grown. In St. Paul's famous list from Galatians 5, we have reached the fruit of patience. And I think this may be especially hard even for God to grow in American hearts, because we are an infamously impatient people. Now, that has helped to drive the dynamism of our nation, but it can also make it harder for us to slow down and appreciate life. It can cause frustration when our desired goals remain out of reach. It can make it especially tough to endure hardship or suffering. I mean, we want solutions, and we want them immediately. As people often say, only half tongue-in-cheek, I want patience, and I want it now. So God has his work cut out for him to grow the fruit of patience in our lives. But there is a remarkable biblical account of God doing just that. After the disaster in Israel that's recorded in the book of Judges, God finally allowed Israel to have a king. The idea before that was that God was king over Israel. The judges were raised up to rule in his stead during times of crisis. But if you joined the Ripped from the Headlines faith group study, you know how that turned out. And so the people clamored for a king, and God finally agreed. And the first king in Israel was Saul. But Saul turned out to be a sad, tragic figure. He had some great qualities, but he lacked confidence in his decisions and had very poor judgment. Later in life, he was afflicted with mental illness. Perhaps depression? Don't exactly know, but it's clear that he was not emotionally well. And so even though Saul was still on the throne, God sent the prophet Samuel to anoint a new king. And that account is in 1 Samuel 16. Samuel sent him to a man named Jesse in Bethlehem. And Jesse was blessed with 8 sons, all of whom seemed to be king material. And yet God rejected the first 7 of them. Like Samuel was sort of wondering, what now? But it turned out there was one more son, the runt of the litter. He was out watching the sheep in the pasture. And so Samuel insisted that he come in, and that was the one God wanted. That was David. And Samuel anointed him king right on the spot. The problem, of course, that Saul was still on the throne. And Saul also had been chosen by God. And so David had to wait very patiently for his chance actually to rule in Israel. And that got much harder as Saul became insanely jealous of David. In fact, eventually David fled and lived like a fugitive, hiding in caves in the hill country of Judah. He made money by hook or by crook, including running a kind of protection racket. He even went and lived with the Philistines for a long period of time. And it's interesting that later, when he was king, his personal bodyguard was made up of Philistine mercenaries. Well, as David is chasing around the countryside, Saul led his army to try to track him down and to kill him as a rival to the throne. But in all that time, David made no move to stage a coup or to usurp the throne. And that's in spite of the fact that during this long standoff, David was presented two golden opportunities. The first one is in 1 Samuel 24, where Saul is chasing David in very rugged territory, and at one point he stops and goes into a cave to relieve himself. Now, if you have a very literal Bible translation, it might say that Saul went in to cover his feet. That's what the Hebrew actually says. But it just reflects this curious squeamishness in Israel about bodily functions. The clear meaning of the phrase is that Saul needed a latrine. But wouldn't you know, he managed to choose the one cave David and his band of merry men were hiding way in the back. Well, David's men saw this as a gift from God. I mean, let's solve the problem here and now. Saul had made David his enemy, and all is fair in love and war, right? And it would get David to the throne immediately. And in fact, David was seriously tempted. He crept up behind Saul, who was apparently concentrating on the business at hand, and cut off a little corner of his outer cloak. And yet the text says that David was instantly struck by heavy, profound guilt just for doing that. And so he ordered his men not to kill Saul. But instead, once Saul had left the cave, David went out and called to him. And he held up the corner of the robe to show Saul that David could have assassinated him. But the fact that he did not proved that David had no intention of displacing Saul. And given that, he begged Saul to stop chasing him, stop trying to kill him. And at that moment, Saul was deeply moved by David's mercy and his restraint. He even acknowledged that David would end up succeeding him on the throne rather than one of his own sons. But Saul was so emotionally unstable that it didn't last. And David was still living like a brigand, like some kind of outlaw or a fugitive. And, again, not always very respectably. Well, in 1 Samuel 26, a group of people who were loyal to Saul told him where David was hanging out. And Saul moved to capture him. But David had his own spies, and he learned where Saul was camped for the night. So David and another soldier named Abishai crept down into Saul's camp at night. And apparently no guards were posted, or they'd fallen asleep, because David and Abishai walked right into the camp, right up to where Saul was sleeping on the ground. And more than that, worse than that, Saul's spear was jabbed into the ground right by his head. Well, Abishai thought that God had given Saul to David on a silver platter. But again, David would not take advantage of the situation. This is from 1 Samuel 26, starting in verse 8. Abishai said to David, God has given your enemy into your hand today. Now, therefore, let me pin him to the ground with one stroke of the spear. I will not strike him twice. Meaning, I won't need to. I'll get him the first time. But David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can raise his hand against the Lord's anointed? Meaning, the king God chose. Who could do that and be guiltless? David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him down, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. But now take the spear that is at his head and the water jar, and let us go. So David took the spear that was at Saul's head and the water jar, and they went away. No one saw it or knew it, nor did anyone awake. For they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen on them. Now, if the deep sleep came from God, wouldn't you think that Abishai was right? Here's your chance. Here's the golden opportunity. Grab it. The Lord is handing Saul over to you. But David knew that his becoming king was not the only issue here. He refused to try to hurry God's plan along, the way, say, that Abraham and Sarah did when they had a child by Hagar before Isaac was born. As David notes a couple of times, Saul was an anointed king of Israel. And he was chosen by God to rule over the nation. And David would not take the initiative to end that call. And so he did not try to take the throne until God opened the way for him to receive it. He said, Saul will die of old age, or he'll die in battle. Something will happen, but only then will I attempt to be king over Israel. Well, here David expressed and exhibited a deeper understanding of patience. It's not only waiting for an opportunity to arrive or finding a chance. It's not only wanting to see my goals reached or my desires achieved. It's waiting for the right time, one that is in accord with God's will for me and for the world. It means trusting God, even when it seems, as it must have to David during those years, that God's promises will never be fulfilled. So patience as a fruit of the Spirit is waiting on God's good time. But that isn't just the challenge. It's also the key. Because it frees us to put things in God's hand, to trust His direction. That doesn't mean being passive or failing to plan or not taking reasonable risks. But it does allow us to let opportunities unfold, to endure setbacks, to handle failures, and to move ahead in confident trust that God will provide. That kind of patience, rooted in God's will, is a tremendous blessing. It is a true fruit of the Spirit. So now I have some great discussion together on the gift and the challenge, the promise of patience. As a fruit of the Spirit, God works within us.